Not liking guests is not about being introverted. It's not about being tired. And it's not about being antisocial. It's about control. If someone's presence in your space feels invasive rather than neutral, something deeper is happening, and it has nothing to do with manners or hospitality. Most people get this wrong, including the people who experience it. The common explanation sounds harmless. I just value my personal space. I get drained by people. I need time alone to recharge. These are surface-level stories. They are socially acceptable narratives, not psychological explanations. This is not about energy levels. This is not about personality traits. And it's not about being wired differently. Those explanations protect self-image. They prevent deeper inspection. What's actually operating here is a threat response, a quiet one, but a real one. The discomfort around guests is not caused by people. It's caused by what their presence does to your internal hierarchy. A home is not just a physical space. Psychologically, it is a control zone. It is where your nervous system downshifts, where roles dissolve, where vigilance drops. When someone enters that space, your brain performs an immediate recalculation. Who is watching me? Who am I responsible for now? Who sets the rules? For people who dislike guests, the answer is never neutral. Guests introduce unpredictability. Unpredictability activates monitoring. Monitoring activates self-regulation. You are no longer just existing. You are being perceived. Even if no one is judging you, the brain behaves as if they are. Posture changes. Tone adjusts. Behavior becomes managed. This is not social anxiety in the classic sense. It's role enforcement. The presence of a guest forces a version of you to appear. A version that knows how to host, accommodate, regulate, explain, respond. For some people, that version feels artificial. For others, it feels dangerous. Because historically, being observed came with consequences. People who dislike having guests are often highly self-contained. They rely on internal systems rather than external regulation. They self-soothe. They self-structure. They self-monitor. Their sense of stability comes from autonomy. Guests disrupt that autonomy, not emotionally, structurally. Another human in the space means shared reality. Shared reality means negotiation. Negotiation means loss of unilateral control. Even polite guests create subtle pressure, conversation pacing, environmental adjustments, emotional availability. Nothing is explicitly demanded, but everything is implicitly required. The brain interprets this as cost, not emotional cost, cognitive cost, and some nervous systems are especially sensitive to that calculation. In many cases, this pattern traces back to early environments where privacy was not respected, not necessarily through abuse, often through inconsistency. Homes where boundaries were porous, where moods could shift suddenly, where presence meant performance. Children in those environments learn something precise. Being alone is safe. Being observed is work. They develop an internal economy where solitude equals regulation and company equals demand. As adults, this doesn't show up as fear. It shows up as irritation, avoidance, rationalization. I just don't like guests. But the body remembers something else. It remembers that being watched once required vigilance, and vigilance is expensive. People who avoid guests often function well socially elsewhere. They can be charming, competent, even warm, because those environments are framed. There are rules, timelines, roles, work ends, meetings conclude, public interactions have exits, guests don't. A guest in your home has undefined duration, undefined expectations, and unclear boundaries, the brain cannot fully relax because it doesn't know when the role ends, so it stays alert. And prolonged alertness is experienced as aversion, not because the guest is unpleasant, but because the state is unsustainable. There's also a quieter layer. Guests reverse authority. Even in your own home, hospitality culture subtly places the guest at the center. You adjust, you accommodate, you consider. For people with a strong internal locus of control, this inversion is destabilizing, not consciously threatening, but psychologically irritating. They don't feel invaded, they feel displaced. Their space stops being an extension of self and becomes a shared stage. And on a stage, you are never fully off. Most people respond to this discomfort incorrectly. They label themselves as bad hosts. They force themselves to tolerate it, or they over-intellectualize it as introversion. None of that addresses the mechanism. The real shift is not behavioral, it's positional. The issue is not guests, it's the assumption that presence requires performance. That assumption was learned, and it can be unlearned, but not through reassurance, through reframing authority. When someone enters your space, your nervous system asks a question: who adjusts to whom? If the answer is always me, resistance forms. If the answer is unclear, regulation is possible. This is not about becoming more welcoming. It's about dissolving the internal hierarchy that turns presence into obligation. People who are comfortable with guests are not more social. They are less internally reactive. They do not assign meaning to observation. They do not interpret presence as evaluation. Their internal stance is simple. I remain myself. Others adapt if they wish. This is not arrogance. It's psychological solidity. They do not host from compliance. They host from stability. The difference is invisible externally, but profound internally. One posture drains, the other does not. For those who dislike guests, the work is not to tolerate discomfort. It's to identify the moment the internal role activates, the moment you stop inhabiting your space and start managing it. That shift happens silently, and once you can see it, it loses power. So if you don't like having guests, don't ask whether you're antisocial. Ask something more precise. When someone enters your space, what version of you appears? And who taught you that this version was necessary? Because the problem was never the guest. It was the role you learned to play when someone is watching. Why guests trigger vigilance rather than connection? When guests enter the home, the body often reacts before the mind does. There is a subtle shift. Breathing changes, muscles tighten, attention sharpens. This happens because the brain no longer treats the space as fully safe and predictable. Home is usually the one place where nothing is required. No explanations, no roles, no adjustments. The moment a guest arrives, that changes. Connection requires relaxation. Vigilance does not. When another person is present, even a friendly one, the brain starts monitoring. Am I being watched? Am I responding correctly? Is the atmosphere comfortable? These questions run in the background, often without words. The nervous system moves from rest into management mode. Guests also introduce uncertainty. You don't fully know how long they will stay, what they will need, or how much attention they expect. This uncertainty keeps the mind alert. Instead of flowing naturally, behavior becomes slightly controlled. You think before you speak. You notice your tone. You adjust your actions. None of this feels dramatic, but it adds up. For many people, This alert state blocks emotional closeness. It is difficult to feel connected when part of the mind is busy maintaining order. The focus shifts from being with someone to handling the situation. Even silence becomes effortful because it no longer belongs only to you. Vigilance is not about distrust of the guest. It is about losing full ownership of the moment. As long as the brain feels responsible for the environment, connection remains secondary. Why hosting feels like performance instead of presence. For many people, the moment they start hosting, they stop simply being. Attention shifts outward. Instead of feeling the moment, they begin managing it. The mind tracks small details, how the room looks, whether the guest is comfortable, what should happen next. Presence is replaced by monitoring. Hosting activates a role. That role comes with rules. Be attentive, be responsive, be pleasant. Even when no one asks for anything, the expectation is assumed. The body stays slightly tense, as if something could be required at any second. This makes relaxation difficult. You are technically at home, but internally you are on. Performance does not always look dramatic. It can be quiet, smiling at the right time, choosing words carefully, filling silence so it doesn't feel awkward. These actions seem minor, but they pull attention away from internal experience. Instead of feeling grounded, you feel split, part of you observing yourself. Presence requires safety. Performance comes from responsibility. When hosting, many people feel responsible, not just for the space, but for the emotional state of the guest. If the guest is bored, uncomfortable, or quiet, it feels like a personal failure. This pressure turns into action, into task management. Over time, the brain learns a simple association. Hosting equals effort. Even if nothing goes wrong, the cost is felt. The mind remembers the vigilance, not the connection. So next time, the body prepares in advance, tightening before the guest even arrives. Hosting stops being shared time and becomes a controlled presentation of self. Why politeness can increase internal pressure. Politeness looks calm on the outside, but internally, it often creates tension. Being polite means holding back natural reactions. It means filtering thoughts, adjusting tone, and choosing behavior that feels acceptable rather than authentic. Each small adjustment adds pressure, even if it goes unnoticed in the moment. When a person prioritizes politeness, they constantly scan the situation. Is this response appropriate? Am I being too quiet, too distant, too direct? The mind stays busy managing impressions. This turns interaction into a mental task instead of a shared experience. You are no longer responding naturally. You are editing yourself in real time. Politeness also removes clarity. Instead of saying what you actually feel or need, you soften it, delay it, or hide it completely. This creates internal conflict. One part of you wants to relax or set limits. Another part insists on staying agreeable. That split requires effort to maintain. The pressure increases because politeness is open-ended. There's no clear signal that the role can stop. You don't know when it's acceptable to be less attentive or more honest. So the body stays alert. Muscles remain slightly tense. Breathing becomes shallow. The nervous system never fully settles. Over time, the brain associates politeness with self-suppression. Even when nothing goes wrong, the cost is felt internally. What looks like kindness from the outside feels like restraint on the inside. This is why polite interactions can feel heavier than honest ones. The pressure doesn't come from others. It comes from constantly holding yourself in place. The psychological impact of feeling on stage at home. Feeling on stage at home creates a quiet but constant psychological strain. Home is meant to be a place where the mind can loosen control. When that doesn't happen, the nervous system stays alert. The body behaves as if it is being watched, evaluated, or expected to perform, even when no one is openly demanding anything. This feeling often comes from needing to maintain an image. You monitor how you look, how you speak, how productive or pleasant you appear. Small actions stop being automatic. Sitting, resting, or doing nothing starts to feel wrong. You feel pressure to justify your presence through activity or usefulness. Over time, this disrupts emotional regulation. Without moments of full release, emotions don't process properly. Irritation builds quietly. Fatigue becomes mental rather than physical. Even silence feels tense because it no longer signals safety, only absence of feedback. The brain also loses a clear boundary between private and public states. When you are always on, there is no off mode. This can reduce creativity and motivation because both require mental freedom. Instead of exploring thoughts or feelings, the mind stays focused on control and self-monitoring. Loneliness can increase in this state, even if others are present. Being on stage prevents genuine connection. You are seen, but not felt. You interact through roles rather than through presence. Eventually, home stops functioning as a recovery space. Rest feels incomplete. Sleep may come, but without deep relief. The psychological cost is subtle but cumulative. What drains energy is not action itself, but the inability to stop performing. The cost of always adapting to others. Always adapting to others slowly shifts how a person experiences themselves. Attention moves outward instead of inward. You start scanning the room for signals, moods, expectations, unspoken rules. Your own needs become background noise. They are noticed only after exhaustion appears. This constant adjustment trains the brain to prioritize safety over authenticity. The nervous system learns that harmony is achieved by self-editing. You change tone, behavior, opinions, and even energy levels to avoid tension. Over time, this creates internal pressure because the self is never fully expressed, only managed. Decision-making becomes harder. When you are used to adapting, you lose quick access to what you actually want. Choices feel heavy because every option is filtered through how others might react. Even small decisions require mental effort, which increases fatigue. Emotionally, this pattern leads to quiet resentment, not explosive anger, but a dull sense of being unseen. You give flexibility, understanding, patience, yet rarely receive the same level of adjustment in return. The imbalance isn't always obvious, but it is felt. Adaptation also weakens boundaries. When you are skilled at accommodating, others assume availability. Your limits remain invisible because they are rarely enforced. Saying no feels disruptive, even when yes is damaging. Over time, identity becomes blurry. You know how to fit in many situations, but struggle to feel solid in any of them. Rest doesn't fully restore energy because the mind stays alert, ready to adapt again. The cost is not kindness itself, but the absence of a stable internal position where no adjustment is required. How constant availability erodes internal safety. Being constantly available changes how the brain experiences security. When someone is always ready to respond, to help, or to accommodate, the mind never fully relaxes. Every notification, message, or request triggers a subtle alert. The body tenses, attention sharpens, energy is mobilized. The sense of home or mental quiet fades because you are always on call. Availability creates an invisible obligation. Even if no one demands anything directly, your nervous system registers responsibility. Your choices are filtered through the expectation of others. Saying no, delaying, or taking space feels uncomfortable because your mind has learned that presence equals approval or connection. Internal safety is compromised because boundaries are weak or inconsistent. Over time, constant availability changes emotional regulation. Restless attention becomes default. Irritation or fatigue may appear without clear cause. Sleep can feel shallow because the mind anticipates interruptions. Even simple moments of solitude are tinged with tension. You are not alone with yourself. You are on standby for everyone else. This constant state also blurs the distinction between self and others. You respond automatically to needs, cues, and moods. Your energy is a resource for others, not for yourself. Over time, identity feels fragmented. The brain learns that your value is in accessibility, not in your internal world. Safety, once anchored in solitude and self-direction, erodes, leaving a subtle but persistent strain that is hard to notice until exhaustion accumulates. Why some people feel displaced in their own homes. Feeling displaced at home happens when the space stops feeling like a sanctuary. Instead of relaxation, the mind constantly scans for expectations, judgments, or potential demands. Even familiar surroundings start to feel foreign because attention is focused on how you should behave rather than how you want to feel. Home becomes a stage rather than a refuge. This sense often comes from internalized pressure. You anticipate the reactions of family, roommates, or guests. Every choice, from where to sit, to what to say, to how long to rest, feels observed. Small details, like tidiness or noise, gain exaggerated importance. You are physically present, but mentally elsewhere, constantly adjusting to an imagined audience. Over time, the brain learns to associate home with performance. Spaces meant for comfort and restoration trigger vigilance instead. Quiet moments feel hollow because the mind expects interruption, disapproval, or responsibility. Emotional relaxation becomes difficult, replaced by subtle tension and alertness. The familiar no longer feels safe. Loneliness and isolation increase. You are surrounded by people or possessions, but connection fades. Interactions feel scripted, and personal needs take a backseat. Home stops being a source of energy and becomes a place where mental effort continues. The cost is cumulative. Small, repeated moments of self-monitoring build into ongoing stress, making the place where you should feel most yourself feel like somewhere else entirely.